The universe that I've set up for my Pokemon Superhero series is one of my absolute favorites that I've made on the channel so far. Even though this is only the second episode set in that universe, because this isn't the same universe as my other superhero series. And today I'm not even continuing the story from the perspective of the characters established in the first episode. We're actually looking at this universe through the lens of the villains. That's not to say that some of the characters from last time won't be showing up, but I think I should just get into the story, because if I keep going I'm gonna end up spoiling something. So let's get into it, shall we? Let's go. Hit like if you want, subscribe if you feel like, but either way, enjoy the show. Meyer Oath was leaping out of bed the second he heard the first chime of his alarm. He was sore and grouchy from his last few jobs, still having an odd twitch from being electrocuted one too many times, but he had a mission and he was eager to achieve it at any costs. He considered flipping on the TV as he got ready, but decided against it, knowing exactly what it would be spouting. More news about the dozens of new vigilante heroes popping up every day, inspired by a group of so-called heroes that were publicly opposing President Giovonni's important safety laws that kept empowered people from just doing whatever they wanted and putting everyone in danger. Or at least that's how it was being framed. Deep down, Meyer knew that Giovonni's laws were largely self-serving, as he could profit off security companies significantly more when heroes were restricted to only being legally allowed to work for his rocket force. But Meyer didn't actually care. Giovonni had been the first person to ever give Meyer a true sense of purpose, back before the man had become the president. Meyer had gone to Hollywood to try and make it big as an actor, but didn't have the skills or work ethic at the time to pull it off. He thought the fact that he was a superhuman might give him an edge, but his powers weren't particularly impressive as far as heroes went. He had clawed hands, slightly above average speed and agility, and strangest of all, he could spawn and respawn a yellow shiny crest on his forehead that he could hurl at people. It looked almost like a gold coin, but would melt and dissolve a few minutes after leaving his body. With no prospects appearing in the acting world for him, Meyer ended up stealing food to get by, and eventually joined a gang to have some organized crime jobs to help ends meet. Eventually, though, his heart fell onto something more important than money, and her name was Martha. She was a beautiful, elegant daughter of a wealthy family, and the second Meyer had seen her, he was infatuated. But she saw him as little more than a street rat. She wanted a strong man of authority to be with, and boisterously rejected Meyer. But he wasn't disheartened completely. Yet. If she wanted a strong man of authority, he'd just have to become one. He looked into how he could become a police officer, but realized with his criminal record, that wasn't likely an option. But that was when he found a budding private sector security company that employed both regular humans and superhumans. It was owned and run by a local politician named Sakaki Giovonni. He was much more willing to give those with criminal pasts a second chance to join his company. In fact, many of his employees were ex-cons. Meyer thought this was a perfect fit. He joined up in the early days of the company, started getting into better shape, and did any job he was given, no matter how shady it sounded. In fact, Meyer thrived in some of the more underhanded work. He eventually rose up the ranks enough to be Giovonni's right-hand man. Unfortunately, this didn't impress Martha much. In fact, at all. When Meyer went to her in uniform with his improved physique, thinking he'd be showing off, she even more adamantly rejected him, claiming Giovonni was a tyrant and that he should be ashamed of himself for working for such a man. But at that point, Meyer found he didn't really care about what she thought of him. He'd found work doing something that he was genuinely good at and enjoyed, and had a sense of true purpose for once. He walked away from her with a smirk, and never saw her again. Over the next years, Giovonni's company grew to its current state as the world-renowned Rocket Force. Of course, as the company grew to become the core police force for the whole country of Kanto, many more impressive superpowered people came on board, and eventually Giovonni took on a new right hand, a woman with similar yet overall more powerful abilities to Meyer, who went by the codename Purslash. Meyer was angry at first, and was still to this day determined to prove himself more useful to Giovonni than Purslash, but there was at least the added benefit that he'd been reassigned to a team of two non-powered people who ended up becoming very close friends of Meyer's. They didn't have the cleanest backgrounds themselves, but Jesse and James liked Meyer just as he was, and were just as driven to achieve the same goals. Currently, that meant capturing the hero, Sparkstreak, aka Pikachu. The team of heroes publicly opposing Giovonni, now called the Assembled, were gaining a lot of traction and attention, but their main draw card didn't seem to be the obvious one. The hero in their ranks that had gotten them their initial audience with the world was Aquajaw. He was both a once well-regarded hero and the current champion of the Elite Fighting League. But now people seem to be rallying even more behind the son of a retired hero, Sparkstreak. The boy had taken on his mother's hero name, and people loved him. He had boy band sorta looks and was an underdog who was proving to be more than capable of holding his own, fighting against any forces sent against the still growing team. He was currently considered the head of the snake that was the Assembled that they needed to cut off. And to kill this snake, Meyer and his friends were going to need a snake of their own. Meyer's core team was composed of himself, Jesse Musashi, and James Kojiro. They'd all work together for years as a unit, but would also often bring in other superpowered Rocket Force agents along on their missions to have a bit of extra fighting power. One of their frequent allies would be joining them on their current outing, an agent that went by Viper Sly. Her abilities made it pretty easy for her to decide early on to give herself a snake-based identity. She had fangs that could expel toxins that paralyzed her foes, and when she grapples someone, wrapping her limbs around them in any way, she can tighten her muscles more and more, constricting her body to squeeze the very life out of them. On her suit, she also tended to wear a blade imbued with some of her venom. She and Jesse tended to butt heads sometimes, but she was the right person for the job they were going out on. She wasn't someone who could be sent on publicly visible missions because of her intense aggression and ruthless fighting style, but that wouldn't be a problem for this outing. There was an old abandoned Rocket Force base on an island just off Kanto that they'd received intel Pico and the Assembled were going to hit to try and find any dirt on Giovanni's past that they could expose. Giovonni personally requested that 3 different teams be sent to the island, 2 of which would go down through and comb the facility. Meyer and his group were to keep watch up top. It seemed like overkill sending that many agents to protect an old abandoned base, but Meyer wasn't one to turn down a mission, or openly question Giovonni. Meyer had met up with Jesse and James, then Viper Sly, who was eager to get out into the field, though wasn't thrilled to hear that it may just involve sitting around and hiding. Her outfit was very dark, and would be easily concealed on the island at night. Meyer put on his black uniform instead of his usual supersuit, as their job was to hide and keep watch. If Pico and the Assembled showed up, they were meant to report to those scrubbing the facility below, then try and take them out silently. Meyer's hope was that Viper Sly could paralyze Pico quickly, and even if it didn't all go to plan, they could at least bring him in to Giovonni. They all went out to a Rocket Force airfield and hopped onto a jet. Though as they did, Meyer saw the other agents being sent. They were some of the heaviest hitters in the Rocket Force. Something else was up here. He knew it, but he tried to keep his mind on the mission, unaware of just how off the rails the mission was going to go. The island looked how Meyer had expected. It was essentially a wide rocky platform with a 2-story metal building on it. The structure was rusted and worn, though seemed to have a pretty intense set of locks on the main door. The 2 teams going down and in spent at least 5 minutes putting in various combinations and turning latches before getting the door open. It was a strange sight, as with some of the people on that mission, certainly some of them could have just blown the door down. It was an abandoned facility, or so Meyer thought. One of the agents likely could have done it herself. Queen Needle. She was like a human tank. She and her husband, King Spear, had both joined the Rocket Force in their early days, like Meyer, and he'd seen them both in action many times. They each had super strength, armor-plated skin, and poison spikes jutting from their bodies. Either Queen Needle could have taken that door down and didn't to keep it intact for some reason, or it was genuinely too strong for her, in which case, why did this place have such intense security? The door eventually creaked open, and the other teams went inside, shutting it behind them. Meyer, Viper, Jesse, and James all waited patiently. Well, they waited, anyway. Viper's leg was twitching the whole time, eager for some kind of action. She and Jesse snipped at each other a bit, then started cracking jokes together. They had an odd relationship. After a few hours, Meyer grew incredibly suspicious of how long it could possibly take to search through this place. It was supposedly abandoned and only looked 2 stories tall. It must have had a basement. Or maybe multiple basements. Meyer was only supposed to report down to the teams inside if Pico and the assembled arrived, but he grew too antsy. He turned on his walkie and called down asking for an update. All that came back was static. He tried again, and at first, still nothing. But then a cry came through. "Report to Giovonni! Urgent! Code red! He's awake!" But the mic cut out, and static returned. They'd all heard it and were about ready to leap up and go inside, until they saw a light approaching on the water. It got closer and closer until Meyer recognized it as a small yacht, and at its helm was Aquajaw. Pico's team was here. Meyer tried calling down again through the walkie quietly to the people below, but no response. Something was going seriously wrong, but in the very least they could make sure to get one thing right on this mission. Meyer quietly gestured to the team with an intricate set of hand movements, but they had no idea what he was trying to say. He then whispered for Vipersly to sneak around the rocks near the shore to get behind the assembled. If she could paralyze one or even a few of the members, this fight could be a cakewalk. She didn't like sneaking around, but she did as requested. Meyer watched her slither around silently as their rivals walked up onto land. The group was still growing, but consisted of their trainer, Ash Ketchum, who had no powers himself, Pico, Aquajaw, Sidewinder, who was a bladed, green-clad hero from the prior days of heroes who was now grown up, and finally a brawler who just went by the name Primal. Vipersly got around behind them, made sure nobody else was getting off the boat, then crept up closer. Aquajaw was at the back of the pack, and taking him out first would be a huge advantage. But just before she could strike, the massive 3-foot thick metal door exploded off the building and flew right at the team. They all leapt out of the way, including Vipersly, to see Queen Needle's unconscious body dented into the door that now lay flat on the rocky ground. Everyone on the island looked up as a being in an armored supersuit floated up out of the building above them all. A voice suddenly bellowed through Meyer and everyone else's mind like a shock of thunder.
"Where is Sakaki Giovonni?"
Meyer didn't know how to react to what was happening, but just listened at first, as Pico and his team spoke up, asking if this being had been a prisoner of Giovanni's. They said they'd heard this island was a place where Giovonni illegally experimented on superpowered people. When Meyer heard this, he didn't see much reason to doubt it, and actually wondered at first if Giovanni's people had come up with a way to enhance his own powers. But his thoughts were cut off as the floating being thrust out his arm. A purple glow swirled around Ash and lifted him into the air. The being's thoughts suddenly burst through everyone's mind again.
"Beings of power, why do you associate with this mindless filth?"
His head suddenly turned directly to where Meyer, Jesse, and James were hiding. Seconds later, Jesse and James too floated up into the air, choking as though they were being held by their necks.
"We are the future of this world. Beings like these, like Giovonni, want to control us because they know we are the beings truly worthy of running this world."
The second he'd seen Jesse and James in trouble, Meyer started clawing his way up the building. He got just above the floating figure and leapt off the roof at him. Unfortunately, he spun around and thrust out a hand to telekinetically stop Meyer mid-leap.
Why do you defend those who are so beneath you?
Meyer struggled in the air, trying to swim his way over to Jesse and James. Because I know they'd defend me right back, bud. I don't care what you think about regular people, but if you think I'm gonna let you hurt my regular people, you got another thing coming. Suddenly, an eruption of lightning exploded from Pico on the ground at the floating figure. He'd been too distracted to block it and succumbed to the shock. Ash, Jesse, James, and Meyer all fell to the ground. The foe flexed his body and a purple aura emitted from him to block the lightning. Vipersly had abandoned her objective and leapt up at the figure, blade swinging ready to paralyze him. But he caught her out of the air and hurled her into the wall. Meyer started hurling dozens of his gold coins at the figure, but all it did was slightly irritate him. Though it was also distracting. Queen Needle had managed to shake off her attack and get up. She wasn't a fan of Pico's team, but given the situation, was willing to team up. She grabbed Aquajaw and hurled the brutish hero with all her might. He shot like a rocket at their foe and chomped right into the armor, tearing it apart with his teeth. While the figure tried to wrestle him off, Vipersly was able to hop up and clamber up the side of the building. More gracefully than Meyer had. She leapt off the wall and drove her blade right into a hole opened in the armor by Aquajaw. It pierced right through to the being's skin and made him reel back in pain. He thrust his arms out and a purple shockwave exploded off him, sending Viper and Jaw flying into the water. The figure should have been going down in paralysis, but it just seemed to be woozy. It hovered higher into the air, and once more its voice bellowed through all their minds.
Tell Giovonni that his past is coming back to stop him from standing in the way of our world's future.
He then flew off into the sky, leaving the odd cluster of fighters to regain their composure. Aquajaw swam back to shore carrying Vipersly. The two groups faced off. Part of Meyer's mind still cycled through many different ways he could possibly snatch Pico out of the group to bring back to Giovonni, but it did strike him as much more important to figure out what that thing was that they just let loose onto the world, especially with the strong sense that it seemed to have an adamant disdain for anyone without powers, meaning Giovonni, Jesse, James, and billions of other people in the world may suddenly be in grave danger. There were no allegiances made, but Meyer, Pico, and the whole group acknowledged that, with that thing out there, there may come another time when they all needed to work together once more.
Well, I'm pretty happy with this as our round 2, though I do still think I might like the Heroes episode better, which you might want to check out if you're new to the channel, but I am definitely glad that I redrew Seviper. I do like the second version a lot better. By the way, there will be an episode of the Design Notes podcast going up on the PopCross Studios Patreon on Wednesday, where I'll talk about the art from this episode, how I came up with the designs, and the story, and all that kind of stuff. And I'll talk about the 2 Sevipers in it. PopCross Patreon, linked in the description. Anyway, besides that, that's all for today, except of course for ending this video on some kind of positive or inspiring note. And the thought I want to leave people with today is actually a tactic that I used in my first year of building PopCross Studios while I was still working another job, working crazy hours for a year, to keep myself in a better mindset and on track and working when there were some really low moments. What I'd do is I'd picture myself coming back in time to tell me how great the success feels when I get there, and confirming that I do eventually get there. Now, a lot of those things that I would pretend I was coming back to tell myself are actually real parts of my life, and I still use this tactic when there are other things I'm striving towards. I hope that's inspiring to someone out there. Thank you so much for watching, everybody. I love you all, and I'll see you all in the next episode on Friday. Goodbye.